The question is this House to now adjourn. Lilian Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's just over 9 years since I became the Member of Parliament for Nottingham South, and in that time I've secured a number of debates on housing and homelessness. I wish I could say that my contributions had led to an improvement in the situation for some of my constituency's most vulnerable citizens, but I'm afraid things have got worse rather than better. I'd suggest that every one of us here will have witnessed a sharp rise in the most visible form of homelessness, rough sleeping. Back in 2010, the official count for rough sleepers in Nottingham was 3. I first raised the issue in Parliament in December 2011 because it had risen 6-fold in a year. Andrew Redfern, the Chief Executive of Local Homelessness Charity Framework, was warning that cuts to services and welfare changes were undermining years of success in tackling homelessness. Earlier this year, the number of rough sleepers in Nottingham reached a record high of 55. 8 years, no better, much, much worse. In March 2013, I secured an adjournment debate on the under-occupancy penalty. Despite the best efforts of the coalition government, the official title never stuck, and we all know it as the bedroom tax. That measure left 6,000 of our city's poorest households with nowhere to go, as the Nottingham Post put it. In March 2015, I led a Westminster Hall debate into affordable housing, and in 2018 I used another adjournment debate to highlight an Opportunity Nottingham report into persistent rough sleeping. The thing I find most shocking looking back on those debates is that on each occasion I was drawing attention to the problems faced by people in the city I represent, not as a result of lack of effort or even just bad luck, but as a direct result of government policy. And what's most shameful is that on each occasion, ministers were warned that their policies would cause hardship, poverty and debt. Mr Deputy Speaker, they were warned, but they pursued those policies anyway. Last week, the Minister assured us that he wants everyone to have security in their home and a roof over their head. I hope that he's serious, because if he is, then he will not want to continue with policies that he knows will make the lives of people in my city and this country harder and poorer. Of course I won't give way.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and the Honourable Lady and I came into this House at the same time in 2010, so certainly these are issues which of course we're very interested in as well. So does the Honourable Lady not agree with me that it's nigh impossible for people to find a private rented, even in what are often known as council estates, within the Local Housing Allowance, and this must be urgently reviewed when the amount of houses available doesn't tally with the housing need in an area, which allows landlords to push for more to cover their overheads to the detriment of our vulnerable who are on housing benefit in a position of living on the breadline just to make the difference.
Well, the honourable member preempts much of my speech and what I'm seeking to set out today, but he is of course entirely right. Today's debate was prompted by research undertaken by Hannah Clemson, Policy and Communications Officer at Advice Nottingham, into the availability and affordability of private rented accommodation in Nottingham City, specifically property within the local housing allowance rate. Now, I should explain, Mr Deputy Speaker, that Advice Nottingham is a consortium of 6 advice agencies based in Nottingham and providing free, confidential and impartial advice on a range of issues, including benefits, debt, employment and housing. They do an incredible job supporting people who are often in desperate circumstances, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to put on record my thanks to them for the work that they do. The availability of affordable homes to rent is clearly an issue of importance to many of my constituents in Nottingham, but it's not only an issue in our city. And this evening's debate is particularly timely given last Thursday's urgent question on the Supreme Court ruling in the case of Samuels versus Birmingham City Council that was led by my colleague, the Honourable Member for Battersea. That case highlighted the impact of the growing gap between actual rents and the amount of rent that's covered by local housing allowance following the government's decision to freeze LHA rates from April 2016. Analysis by Shelter has revealed that there is now a shortfall between LHA and rents at the 30th percentile, in 97% of broad market rental areas in England. As the honourable member said, people cannot find affordable rents, and that's true almost everywhere in this country. Nottingham is one such area, and the freeze on local housing allowance is leaving people homeless and in poverty. Many of my constituents simply cannot afford a home in the private rented sector, yet that is the only choice they have. Now, the government's outdated LHA rates from 2016 show rents in Nottingham to be as low as £42.54 per week. 54 pence per week. In reality, Advice Nottingham has found the cheapest property is now at least £63 per week. Now, Advice Nottingham knew that LHA was not meeting local needs from the work that they do with their clients. They knew that rents were too high and that local people were struggling to find affordable accommodation. But they decided to do their own research to find out exactly how many properties were available in the city within the LHA rates. They undertook this research in November last year within a one-week period. Using Rightmove, Zoopla and Gumtree, they searched the city to find properties. Advice Nottingham found only 12 properties at or below the rate for shared accommodation, and many of those were specifically marketed as student properties, and I'll explain the significance of that later in my speech. They found just 5 one-bedroom flats in the city at or below the LHA rate. Family homes proved even harder to find. There were only 2 two-bedroom properties at or below LHA rate, 3 three-bedroom properties and 1 four-bedroom house in the whole of the city at a rent that would be covered by LHA. More recent work by Nottingham City Council confirms Advice Nottingham's findings. LHA rate is intended to reflect the bottom 30th percentile of local rents. They found that it actually covered less than 7% of one-bedroom flats, less than 3% of two-bedroom properties and less than 5% of three-bed homes. With a shortage of council or housing association properties available, many families are forced to rent properties that they cannot really afford, foregoing other essential household expenditure, including food, heating and clothing, simply to put a roof over their heads.
Should you give way on that point?
I will indeed.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and as usual, the passionate case she's making for our city. The bedroom tax was cruel because even if an individual complied with what the government was trying to coerce them into doing, there wasn't the housing there for them to go to. And this is what we're seeing repeated again with the LHA. And she very correctly highlights the gap, therefore, that people must make up just to get a roof over their head. Does she share the concern that my constituents in the north, as hers in the south, are going without essentials, food, heating, things for their children, just so they can maintain these tenancies, and that's a sign of a system that fundamentally isn't working?
My honourable friend has made a very important point, and I will seek to explain precisely the problem that they are facing, those constituents of his and of mine. And the problem is that the gap they're seeking to fill between the LHA they receive and the rent that they need to pay is not trivial, it is significant. According to Shelter, the gap between 30th percentile rents and the LHA rate in Nottingham is £15.17 a month for a room in a shared house, £55.01 for a one-bedroom flat, £54.57 for a two-bedroom property, £56.61 for a three-bedroom property, and £121.93 per month for a four-bedroom house. These are not trivial amounts, and trying to cover the shortfall is leaving people in a very vulnerable and insecure position, and as my honourable friend has said, in poverty. I will give way to the honourable
for giving way. And I'm sure that she has experienced in her constituency, as others have as well, that whenever people's income is reduced because of the rental accommodation or the benefit changes, that more often than not those people are pushed in towards the food banks. I know in my constituency the Thriving Life Food Bank has been extremely busy, and that's been due to benefit changes, to rental accommodation not being available and just not being able to pay the money, and therefore they fall back upon the food banks, which we're very glad to have, by the way, but with a regularity which is quite dismaying.
The honourable gentleman makes a really important point, and in fact many people, I cannot imagine how they would get by without food banks, but the truth is there will be other people who will not go to a food bank, who perhaps are too proud to go to a food bank, and actually they will be going hungry. And they will be sitting in a house that is cold because they've not turned the heating on. And their children will be going to school in clothing that is too small or that is just simply not appropriate. Or I've heard of children going to school in their pyjamas because they don't have proper clothing. It really is a shameful position. Martin Neal is a senior advisor at the Meadows Advice Group, and he spoke to Advice Nottingham's researcher about his experiences trying to support clients with local housing allowance. He described meeting with 2 clients, one already homeless and one threatened with homelessness. The housing plans given by Housing Aid were almost identical and contained instructions to the client to look for affordable accommodation in the private sector. The LHA was quoted as a guide toward affordability, but absolutely no other guidance was given about how the client should go about this or what difficulties, if any, they would likely encounter. No other support was offered, at least for the next few weeks. Both of Martin's clients were or had been living in the Meadows area of Nottingham and understandably preferred to remain local to be near the schools for their children. Martin says, under the LHA, both clients were entitled to a 3-bedroom home. I logged on to Rightmove and using a 3-mile radius as a start, which would fit with school transport rules, I began my search. There was not a single property available for rent less than £50 a month above the local housing allowance. I extended the radius to 5 miles, which revealed one property in Bulwell. She's in my honourable friend's constituency. This met the local housing allowance. Now, I appreciate that the Minister may or may not know Nottingham well. Bulwell and the Meadows are at opposite ends of the city. A tram ride or 2 buses. Time-consuming and costly, especially for a large family. Sally Denton from Nottingham Law Centre also describes the problem she's witnessed. She says, in the current rental market, where there is a shortage of social housing, there is an increased demand on the private sector. This means landlords can charge more due to the demand. Tenants cannot do anything to challenge the level of rent and cannot move to cheaper accommodation as it does not exist. We see clients regularly who are struggling to pay unaffordable rents. If an unexpected expense occurs or there's a change in income, like the 5-week wait under universal credit, people can very easily fall into rent arrears and risk losing their homes. Nottingham Law Centre isn't alone in identifying this problem. Terry Alafat, the Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Housing, says, our research makes it clear just how far housing benefit for private renters has failed to keep pace with even the cheapest private rents. We fear this policy is putting thousands of private renters on low incomes at risk of poverty and homelessness. How can the Minister preside over a system that forces people to put themselves at risk of debt and eviction? Now, I'm sure that when he responds, he will talk about the government's targeted affordability funding. And whilst, of course, that's welcome, it is simply nowhere near enough to address the problem. In Nottingham, the targeted affordability funding means that the LHA rate for 3- and 4-bedroom houses has increased by 3% in the last year. Now, the monthly shortfall for an LHA claimant renting a 3-bedroom house at the 30th percentile is £56.61 per month, as I said, rather than £60.22. And for a 4-bedroom house, £121.59 rather than £126.14. Yes, it's an improvement, but does the Minister really think that that is sufficient? Now, whilst the freeze on LHA rates is creating this issue, a much bigger problem is the lack of affordable housing. Since 1980, Nottingham has lost 22,000 social homes through Right to Buy. And although Nottingham City Council, Nottingham City Homes and other local housing associations have built new homes, it's nowhere near to make up for those lost. Indeed, the problem has accelerated since discounts were increased in 2012. In the last year, there were 664 applications for Right to Buy to Nottingham City Council, compared to 134 homes bought in 2012-13. There's a huge gap between demand for and supply of social housing. Nottingham City Homes made 1,431 new lets in the last year, but the housing register stood at 8,393. Now, of course, some of those on the housing register are in permanent accommodation, but I know from my constituency casework that too many are inadequately housed. Young families living with their parents, overcrowded or in properties that are unsuitable for their needs. Young families forced to live in high-rise housing. And according to an Inside Housing survey in 2017, almost 40% of council homes sold under right to buy have now been resold and are being let in the private rented sector at higher rents and, even with LHA restrictions, at a higher cost to the taxpayer. What discussions has the Minister had with his colleagues in housing, communities and local government about this ludicrous situation? Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm proud to represent a vibrant and extremely popular university city. But the rise in the city's student population has also contributed to the lack of affordable family housing. Landlords have sought to capitalise on the student market by converting family homes into highly profitable shared accommodation. This growth in HMOs doesn't even help those under 35s whose LHA rate is restricted to shared room rate. Many private rented properties in Nottingham are student-only lets, or as students make up the majority of tenants, if someone entitled to LHA was to live in a student let, the whole cost of council tax would likely fall on that non-student tenant. So even where there does appear to be an abundance of private rented accommodation, much of it is in fact closed off to my constituents on local housing allowance. And unfortunately, this is not the only reason that property is closed off. Shelter have revealed how many landlords discriminate against people on universal credit, and it's no different for other LHA claimants. With the cost of renting so high and the rates so low, private landlords are reluctant to rent to LHA claimants. 43% completely bar claimants and another 18% prefer not to let to them. What plans does his government have to ensure that landlords cannot discriminate in this way? Mr Deputy Speaker, the struggles my constituents are facing are being replicated across this country. Last week, we saw the Supreme Court rule in favour of Mrs Samuels, a single mum with 4 children who was found intentionally homeless by Birmingham City Council because she did not use the subsistence benefits intended for essential living costs to pay the shortfall between her local housing allowance and her rent. Shelter estimates that the majority, 65% of LHA households in private rents across the country also face a monthly shortfall. And their survey of private renters detailed some of the impossible trade-offs that families in receipt of LHA are having to make. For example, 1 in 3 renters have cut back on food for either themselves or their partner, and 37% have been forced to borrow money to pay their rent in the last year. Mr Deputy Speaker, this cannot go on. But last week, the Minister seemed unwilling to address the issue. Can he tell me what assessment he's made of the hardships suffered by households as a result of the freeze in LHA rates? Does he accept that the LHA rate freeze has increased homelessness in Nottingham and across the country? Is he really saying that families should be forced to live below the breadline and use subsistence benefits to pay their rent? The Supreme Court ruling in favour of Mrs Samuels set a precedent, and his department needs to respond urgently. There is a very clear solution. 92% of local authorities responding to the Local Government Association's LHA survey thought that lifting the freeze on LHA rates and better aligning them with rents would help to reduce homelessness in their area. The Residential Landlords Association have said the LHA has a double whammy effect that is driving homelessness. The double whammy means that first, tenants in receipt of housing benefit are more likely than other tenants to have their tenancy ended by their landlord, and secondly, these households are finding it increasingly difficult to find suitable, affordable accommodation in the private rented sector. The Chartered Institute of Housing say, we are calling on the government to conduct an immediate review and to look at ending the freeze on local housing allowance. Shelter, Child Poverty Action Group and many other housing and homelessness charities are saying the same thing. It's time to act and lift LHA rates so that housing benefit covers the true cost of renting in the private sector. Now, his government has pledged to halve rough sleeping in this Parliament and to end it by 2027. I'm afraid that that shows a real lack of urgency. But how can I take that commitment seriously when ministers have repeatedly ignored warnings over the past 9 years and pursued the very policies that have caused homelessness to rise? cutting supporting people funding, changing the basis on which LHA rates are set from the median to the 30th percentile of market rents, restricting people aged 26 to 35 to the shared room rate, introducing the bedroom tax, subjecting families to the benefit cap, restricting and then freezing LHA rates. Now, I don't hold the Minister responsible for the things that happened before he was even an MP, but I will hold him accountable for his actions now. Before he became a minister, he chaired the all-party group on ending homelessness. Now he is in a position to make a real difference. Will he do so? Mr Deputy Speaker, Matt Downey, Director of Policy and External Affairs at Crisis, said recently, homelessness is not inevitable. There is clear evidence that it can be ended with the right policies in place. The government must urgently reform housing benefits for private renters so they not only match the true cost of renting, but also keep pace with future rent changes. Will he end the freeze on local housing allowance? And if so, when? Will he provide additional targeted affordability funding to help those struggling to pay their rent right now? Will he ensure that LHA rates are restored to at least the 30th percentile of local rents? And given that this is a housing crisis, will he call on his colleagues in housing communities and local government to act now to provide more social housing and controls on rent rises? Now that he is in a position to help end one of the causes of homelessness, will the Minister do the right thing?
Minister Will Quince.
Well, thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I would like to thank the Honourable Lady, the member for Nottingham South, for securing this debate. And I haven't had an opportunity to visit Nottingham as of yet in this role, but very much look forward to doing so. I look forward to doing that hopefully over the summer. Since taking up post 2 months ago, I've been keen to engage with as many people as possible, including key stakeholders such as Shelter, Crisis, Homeless Link and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to understand housing issues from all perspectives. And like my honourable friend, I have a keen and long-standing interest in housing and ensuring people have a safe, decent and affordable place to live that meets the needs of the household. And I would like to start by confirming that we have committed to end the freeze to Local Housing Allowance, LHA, in March 2020. Now, reform to housing support was a central part of this government's plan to create a welfare system that both supports the most vulnerable and is fair to taxpayers. To help ensure a fair balance between these two elements, LHA rates are not intended to meet rents in all areas. The intention behind the welfare reform programme is that the same considerations and choices faced by people not in receipt of benefits should also be faced by those claiming benefits, and the LHA policy is designed to achieve this. Mr Deputy Speaker, between 2000 and 2010, housing benefit expenditure had risen by over half in real terms, reaching £25 billion in today's prices. If left unreformed, by 2014-15, housing benefit would have reached £29 billion. That was not sustainable. The measure to freeze local housing allowance rates for 4 years from April 2016 built on reforms introduced in the previous Parliament, which saved £6 billion in total by 2015-16. Savings from freezing LHA rates are estimated to be around £655 million for Great Britain over the 4-year period of the measure. Our reforms provide greater fairness and are part of our wider goal to move people from welfare and into work. However, we have recognised that some places have seen high increases in rents, so we have made provision to further help people in those areas. That is why we've used a proportion of the savings from the freeze to create more targeted affordability funding, which is used to reduce the gap between frozen LHA rates and the 30th percentile. Initially, targeted affordability funding was based on 30% of the savings from the freeze, but at the autumn budget 2017, we invested an additional £125 million into targeted affordability funding for the final 2 years of the freeze, 2018-19 and 2019-20. And this was based on 50% of the savings rather than 30%. This additional funding enabled us to increase 213 LHA rates. There are 960 in total, Mr Deputy Speaker, by 3% last year, 2018-19. This year, a total of £210 million has been made available, the highest amount of targeted affordability funding since its introduction in 2014. And this has enabled us to increase 361 LHA rates by 3%. As a result, it is estimated that this year, 500,000 households will benefit from an increase of around £250 per year. In addition, Mr Deputy Speaker, to this targeted affordability funding, the Government has provided over £1 billion in discretionary housing payments to local authorities since 2011. Discretionary housing payments allow local authorities to protect the most vulnerable claimants and support households affected by different welfare reforms, including the freeze to LHA rates. In Nottingham specifically, 2 of the 5 LHA rates in the broad market rental area were eligible for targeted affordability funding this year. The 3-bedroom and 4-bedroom LHA rates, both of these rates have been increased by 3%. Yes.
I thank the Minister for taking an intervention. And as he rightly says, those levels for 3- and 4-bed properties have been increased. And I set out the levels of increase. So, for example, for a 4-bedroom house, it's been increased by, I think it's £4.55. But that still leaves a shortfall over the year for someone in that position of renting that 4-bedroom house of £1,452. So he's quoted the rates, but the shortfall that people are being asked to make up is huge, is it not? Is he really saying that that's the sort of amount of money that someone should have to find from their other benefits, whether it's their, their child benefit or disability benefits? Is that really right?
Minister.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. I mean, that's exactly why we have introduced the targeted affordability funding and we have made available discretionary housing payments. But it's also why, more broadly, as I explained during the UQ last week, why I'm looking at this in some detail, as I did prior to being a Minister as part of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Ending Homelessness. As I said, Mr Deputy Speaker, the 3-bedroom and 4-bedroom LHA rates in Nottingham, both of these rates have been increased by 3%. The remaining rates in Nottingham did not fall within the criteria of those rates that had diverged the most from local rents and therefore were not eligible for targeted affordability funding this year and therefore remain frozen. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, as I've said, I think twice already, the Government has committed to end the freeze to local housing allowance rates in March 2020, alongside the freeze to other working age benefits. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm conscious the Honourable Lady, just before I go on, did mention a few other points which I would like to cover off as part of my response. They were homelessness, housing supply and no DSS. Just to touch on homelessness first, Mr Deputy Speaker, the causes of homelessness and rough sleeping, and I did a huge amount of work on this area alongside the Honourable Member for Bermondsey and Old Southwark, or it could be Old Southwark and Bermondsey, as co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Ending Homelessness. I know that the causes of homelessness and rough sleeping are understood to be both complex and multifaceted, and in order to fully evaluate these factors, we've commissioned a feasibility study and a rapid evidence review into the causes of homelessness in partnership with the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. And this report has now been finalised and we're working on next steps. But as I said earlier, Mr Deputy Speaker, we want everyone to have security in their homes and a roof over their head. And that's why we have committed over £1.2 billion to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping. We've published a strategy to end rough sleeping by 2027 and halve it by 2022. And that's backed by £100 million of initial funding, and we've changed the law so councils can place families into private rented accommodation so they get a suitable place sooner. And last year, Mr Deputy Speaker, statutory homelessness acceptances fell, and we're going to build on this, and the Homelessness Reduction Act will mean that more people will get the help that they need sooner. Now, the Honourable Lady rightly touched on landlords not letting to those in receipt of benefits, something that's also known as old term no DSS. And this is a hugely important issue. And in February this year, Housing Minister Heather Wheeler announced a government campaign to end no DSS practices, and we recently had a number 10 round table on this very issue with a number of key stakeholders. And we are working with those stakeholders to find a satisfactory resolution. Everyone deserves a safe and secure home, and that's regardless of whether they're in receipt of benefits. Blanket bans do not take account of the individual and the circumstances, and that's why we very strongly discourage them. And we would encourage landlords and agents to consider all potential and existing tenants in receipt of housing benefit and universal credit on an individual basis. And I should say, Mr Deputy Speaker, that we have already seen some real positive changes from property sites who've committed to remove no DSS wording adverts from across their platforms. And lenders have also changed their policies to remove mortgage restrictions that would prevent landlords from renting to tenants in receipt of housing support. Metro Bank is one of the latest to remove such restrictions, and I hope others will follow. But work is ongoing, and we will continue to bring the sector together to tackle these practices.
Minister, it would annoy us greatly if we found that rental landlords were discriminating against people because they were in receipt of benefits or DHSS applicants. So does the Minister agree, or does he feel that if there's discrimination, which quite clearly many of us think in this House there would be, that under discrimination laws it would be illegal to do that? And if so, what action would the Minister, in cooperation with his other ministers of course, be able to take to make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. He raises a very good point, because although it may be discrimination in terms of the terminology we would use, it may not fall under the legal definition of such. And as a result, we think the best way of tackling this issue is working with the key stakeholders, so the landlords, the mortgage lenders, those that provide, for example, insurance, because we know there is a particular issue in that regard. And that's why we had a very successful recent round table at number 10, where I genuinely believe we had a good cross-section of all the key players from across the board, and we are starting to see progress in this area. And I'm sure by taking that collaborative approach, government working with business, key stakeholders and the charity and voluntary sector, we will truly get a grip on this issue and tackle it, because we don't want to see anybody that is in receipt of benefits being discriminated against in this way. Now, the Honourable Lady also touched on... Yes, of course.
Grateful for the Minister allowing intervention before we moved on. I'm going to test the patience of Mr Deputy Speaker, but I know he, like his dogs were successful in the Dog of the Year competition not so long ago, as were my own. So I just want to quickly raise the point of pets to see if the Minister's had a chance to consider this yet, that another hidden way exclusion in an overheated rental market is a no pets policy. Obviously, as an opposition, I don't see this as a particularly partisan issue. As an opposition, we've said that we want to get rid of that in tenancies. I wonder whether the Minister's considered that at all.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. I know he is a dog owner himself. I am a dog owner also, Mr Deputy Speaker. I wouldn't be out without our Charlie. I think my two daughters would rather throw me out than the dog, Mr Deputy Speaker. But I think this is an action issue for the Department for Housing, Communities and Local Government, but I assure the honourable gentleman it is something that I work very closely with across the board in terms of my counterparts in that department, and I have a meeting with them tomorrow and will raise that very issue. Now, the honourable lady also touched on supply, and I suppose this follows on very neatly from the honourable gentleman's point, and that is that I do work very closely indeed with my counterparts at the Department for Housing, Communities and Local Government. You would expect nothing less. LHA rates and aid changes in that regard can only really go hand in hand with how we look at supply, and that's why it is essential that we do have those meetings. And I have such a meeting tomorrow, and I have them very regularly, and it won't come as any surprise to the honourable lady that I will have been and will continue to push my colleagues in that department to look at how we can increase the supply of council, social and affordable housing. Actually, Mr Deputy Speaker, if I may, while I'm here, the honourable lady mentioned Matt Downey of Crisis, and she missed off 3 letters that he now has in the back of his name, and he has recently been awarded, I understand, an MBE from Her Majesty the Queen, and I would like to send my congratulations to Matt, who is a huge asset to that organisation. Now, as a government, Mr Deputy Speaker, we are proud of the progress we've made with our welfare reforms. We now have a record-breaking labour market with over 3.6 million more people in work across the UK compared with 2010. Unemployment is at its lowest rate since the 1970s, having fallen by more than half since 2010. And this government will continue to reform the welfare system so that it promotes work as the most effective route out of poverty, is fairer towards those who receive it and the taxpayer who pays for it. Work is the pillar of a strong economy and a strong society. Mr Deputy Speaker, we believe that work should always pay, and we need a welfare system that helps people into work, supports those who need help, and is fair to everyone who pays for it. Yes, of course.
I hear what the Minister says, but he must be as concerned as I am that so many of those people who are in poverty now are also in work. And in sort of addressing the issue that we're talking about today is, why is it right to force those who are least able to pay for the cost of welfare reform, rather than looking at rents themselves and control on rents as a way of both controlling expenditure on welfare payments, but also protecting those who are most vulnerable from the impact of needing to reduce expenditure?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, but again, I don't entirely recognise the picture that she paints. There have been huge positive changes for some of the lowest paid in our country. The national living wage rose to £8.21, increasing a full-time worker's pay by over £2,750 since 2016. Our tax changes, Mr Deputy Speaker, will make basic rate taxpayers over £1,200 better off compared to 2010. And we, of course, have doubled free childcare available for working parents of 3- and 4-year-olds to 30 hours per week, saving them up to £5,000 per child. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I was touching on universal credit. Universal credit replaces the outdated and complex benefit system of the past, which too often stifled people's potential, creating cliff edges at 16, 24 and 30 hours, and punitive effective tax rates of over 90% for some, punishing claimants for doing the right thing. In the autumn budget last year, we listened to concerns about universal credit delivery and funding and announced a £4.5 billion cash boost to universal credit to ensure that vulnerable claimants and families are supported in the transition to universal credit, and millions keep more of what they earn. We announced a package of additional support for all those being moved onto universal credit worth £1 billion. This includes 2-week continuation of legacy benefits, a 12-month exemption period from the minimum income floor, a reduction in the deductions cap, and an extension of the advances repayment period. In conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, this government remains committed to a strong safety net for those who need it. That is why this government continues to spend over £90 billion a year on welfare benefits for people of working age.
I wouldn't like the Minister to finish without me having ensured that I've understood what he said. He said earlier in his remarks that the freeze on local housing allowance rates would end in April next year. Can I check? Does he mean that LHA rates will also be restored to at least the 30th percentile of local rents, or will they just be allowed to rise from the level that they are now? And given that he's saying that freeze is going to end in, I believe, in April 2020, what additional help is he going to provide for those who are struggling to pay their rent now?
Finished.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I thank the Honourable Lady for her further intervention just before I was reaching the end of my conclusion, and I will comment on what she's just said. But as I said, that is why the government continues to spend over £90 billion a year on welfare benefits for people of working age, and the freeze to LHA rates and working age benefits will end in March 2020. The Honourable Lady rightly asked further questions. That is a decision for the Secretary of State and something I will be working with her very closely on in the coming days, weeks and months.
The question is, this House do no adjourn. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order.